reason that they wanted to take away these buildings was because it was a health, safety, and welfare concern. But that's a police power issue. And the police power does not give you the authority to take what belongs to somebody else. So they have the power, if they needed to go in and destroy a dilapidated building. Or they could require you to mow a lawn that had grown up too high so that rodents and vermin were out there. Those were efforts that the cities were allowed to engage in, but you couldn't take title to it. And so what the cities were concerned about is, well, if the title remains with these slumlords, then that means that they can just let the properties fall into disrepair again after we've gone in and cleaned them up. And so the solution was to pass a law saying that as an exercise of the police power to remediate blight, you could go in, tear down these buildings, and take title from the owner, so that the city would then build its public housing developments. Well, the first law that was passed to this effect was in 1939, and there were a lot of concerns about whether it was really constitutional or not. No one challenged it, so it didn't get up to the Missouri Supreme Court, but there was a constitutional convention that came around in the early 1940s. And at this constitutional convention, some people from the western half of the state said, really, let's make sure that this is not a problem. We like the idea of being able to take these properties and then convert them to uses that we think are proper. And so they passed Article 6, Section 21 into the Missouri Constitution. And that provision allows you to condemn property, to use the power of eminent domain, if a local government or a governmental agency determines that the property is blighted. The constitutional amendment did not define blight. Now, at the time, people understood blight means you got property falling down, it's hazardous, there's a health threat to the community as a result of it. That was the understanding of what blight is. But because they failed to define it in the Constitution, as time went by, cities began to get creative with the way that they defined blight. And so you would have blight declarations coming down the pike because there's grass growing through your sidewalk, or because a building had outlived its purpose and become obsolete. The owner may think it's perfectly well suited to the use that they have for it, but if the city decides that this building is obsolete, then all of a sudden you can call it blighted. And so the condemnation wheel started to roll. And when Missouri courts took a look at it, even though you've got this constitutional provision that's saying if you're trying to condemn for a public use, the courts get to decide whether it's truly a public use, the blight provision didn't say anything like that. And so what the courts did was they said, well, since this is not a public use question, since it's a blight question, we'll defer to the legislatures. And that's essentially a rubber stamp. Or at least it was. Now, I will say that there has been a very tiny glimmer of hope in the landscape in Missouri on the eminent domain front. A couple of years ago, the city of Clayton, which, as we all know, is a downtrodden and blighted area, decided that they were going to condemn an office building that was perfectly serviceable, that was perfectly well maintained, so that the Centene Corporation could build a new headquarters. And the way that they did this was they said, well, we think it's blight. That case went all the way to the Missouri Supreme Court, and for the first time that I have been able to find, the Missouri Supreme Court said, no, city, you're incorrect. This is not really blight. Now the question that we've got is how far-reaching the Centene case is going to be. The way that the Missouri Supreme Court got to that solution was almost on a technicality. The statute that the city of Clayton cited when they were making their blight designation required two separate findings, that it was an economic liability and a health liability. And basically the city, when it was making its declaration, it only checked one of the boxes. So theoretically, if Clayton had gone back and conducted a second study that checked both boxes, the case may well have come out differently. But thankfully, the city of Clayton recognized that it was beaten. They let go the idea of condemning the property, and lo and behold, a year and a half later, they reached a resolution where the property was sold, and now Centene is building their building without the use of eminent domain, which all along, free market advocates have been saying can be done. Really, the question in terms of developing these areas, and I know that in St. Louis as well as in other parts of the state, there's been a lot of talk about how eminent domain is thought to be a necessary tool for development, and that's just not the case at all. We can point back to how development was done for centuries now in the United States without using eminent domain for it. Different cities in the country have taken a hardline stance against the use of eminent domain. The city of Anaheim in California refused to use eminent domain so that developers could help build their projects, and the city's developed fine. Disney World was built without the use of eminent domain. Florida just recently went back and they amended their constitution after the Kelo decision to make sure that Kelo couldn't happen in their state. And development has continued at the same level as everywhere else, even after they said you can no longer use eminent domain to accomplish these developments. So, we now have this section in the Missouri Constitution that has been twisted from its original purpose. And where it was originally intended to try and prevent harms to the health or safety of the community, they've used it instead as a backdoor to condemn for economic development. So the position that we take at the Show Me Institute is that not only is this unnecessary for development, but it's actively harmful to the community. When you have the ability to condemn what belongs to one person just to give it to somebody else, it decreases everyone's confidence in their ability to hold their property. It makes them less likely to improve their property. It reduces the value of their property. The National Association of Realtors has written briefs in several of the eminent domain cases that I've worked on that have pointed out how property values tend to diminish when there's a threat of eminent domain, even when it's just a question of a surety that the city has that authority, as opposed to being assured of strong property rights, strong protections for property rights. And so for all of those reasons, really what Missouri needs to consider doing is adopting a constitutional amendment that would fix this blight exception that was written in the 40s.